Hi, my name is Nabir Sarma, and this is the Trace APUSH review of 1607 to 1754. So, when you use this presentation, we want you to be able to firstly understand how events impacted history. We want you to be able to comprehend historical trends, and we thirdly want you to be able to synthesize documents. Now, APUSH is a subject where you have to study not necessarily specific facts, but how trends of each time era relate to each other and how different groups would respond to different events that happen in history. The basic outline of this presentation is that we want you to be able to answer these questions. Why did European nations colonize the Americas? Uh, what did they want from traveling overseas to America? How did different nations interact with Native Americans? Obviously, different empires, such as the English, the Spanish, the Dutch, and the French, have interacted differently with Native Americans throughout their history. What differentiated the colonies of English America from each other? Um, the colony of Virginia had very different political and social views than the colony of Massachusetts Bay or in South Carolina or in Pennsylvania. How was slavery established in the Western Hemisphere? Slavery is obviously a huge part of American history. And when and why did the colonies undergo social, political, and economic change? Well, this is self explanatory. The colonies were very independent and they went through their own changes as well as changes that were linked to changes in Europe at the time. What did the Great Awakening change about the colonies? This was a huge religious movement that happened in the 18th century and it impacted how colonists viewed liberty and religion. And finally, how did the Enlightenment and European freethinkers impact the New World? So these are some of the historical events that you should be familiar with, not necessarily memorize, but you should be familiar with what is the chronology of these events, as well as these in the 18th century. So the general trends of this era that you should keep in mind while you're studying are the role of women, Indians in the New World, and the status of settlers, as well as the position of Puritans and the economy of the New World. First, we'll start with our review of the colonies. The ones we will look at are Virginia and New England. The ones that we don't have in this video are Pennsylvania, Maryland, and the rest of the Deep South. Those are the big ones that you'll have to study on your own. So before 1607, you should know what are the similarities and differences between Native American communities. All communities did not share a single identity as Native Americans do today. They were very different cultural groups. They did not have a shared language. But one thing they did have in common was the importance of religion in their daily lives, or the importance of ritual. Between the 1450s and 1610s, this was the era known as the Age of Discovery in the Americas, not just in the Americas with Columbus, Cabot, and Cabral, but also worldwide exploration was going on, such as Chinese explorer Zheng He in the Indian Ocean and Vasco da Gama sailing around the Cape of Good Hope around Africa. Spanish conquistadors also played a big role primarily in Latin and South America, where they conquered empires such as the Incas and the Aztecs, who were very powerful for that time. Jamestown was the first permanent English settlement in the Americas. It was initially founded for people to mine gold and silver, but people died a lot that first year in Jamestown. So the Virginia Company, who were the company that owned the charter to Virginia, wanted more people to immigrate to the Americas. So they enacted a system called the headright system, where if a man paid for his or another voyage, then he would get 50 acres of land in the New World. And this was significant because it brought more settlers to Jamestown and to the Virginia colony, and it also sparked the rise of indentured servitude as a main form of labor for the colonies. John Smith was one of the earliest colonial leaders in Virginia. He ruled with an iron fist. He was a military man, and he really wanted the colonists to be able to feed themselves. He said that he shall not work will not receive food. So he really needed the colonists to work together to survive in this new world. Democracy in Virginia first started when the Virginia Company established the House of Burgesses, which was the first democratic institution in the Americas out of the English, Spanish, French, and Dutch empires. Granted, it wasn't very democratic because only land-owning males could vote in the House of Burgesses, and any legislation passed by the House could also be vetoed by the governor of Virginia, which was appointed by the Virginia Company. But because this was the first democratic institution in the Americas in which people could vote, this is significant for the future of the colonies and for the future of America. The cash crop of tobacco wasn't initially the main crop grown in the area. They started out with growing sugar as well as rice in the southern colonies, but later tobacco became the main crop of the southern colonies, as you'll see later in this presentation. Puritanism. This was a religious movement that started in England, and Puritans believed that the Church of England was corrupt and that they sympathized with Catholics. So first they moved to the Netherlands, and after that they moved to the Americas to escape persecution, supposedly. And they, on the way there, they signed the Mayflower Compact, which was a sort of, excuse me, a sort of pre-constitution. It was the first law-making document that was signed in the Americas. Their religious values were very strict, and they believed that people should be restrained to only things that are good, which I'll talk about later. And the government in Massachusetts Bay Colony as well as Plymouth Colony were based on Puritanism. This is a quote from John Winthrop, who was one of the first colonial leaders of Massachusetts. And one important thing about John Winthrop is that he distinguished between two kinds of liberty. He called natural liberty the freedom to do whatever you want. You can do anything you want and nothing's going to happen to you. And then he distinguished that from moral liberty, which is the liberty to only things that are right. So no drugs, no alcohol, no sex, none of those fun things. He thought that people should only be restricted to things that are important to them and to their religion. Separatists were the most extreme Puritans. While Puritans wanted to purify the Church of England, that's what the word Puritan comes from, separatists wanted nothing to do with the church and to start their own religion, basically. Anne Hutchinson was a Puritan in Massachusetts, and because at the time Puritan women could not become full members of the Puritan church, she organized religious meetings for women, and she was persecuted by the governing class of Massachusetts, and she was eventually excommunicated and banished from the colony. Now, later in the 17th century, the Puritan church started losing membership because people were becoming less religious at this time period. So they saw this and decided that they should establish a sort of halfway church membership for people who were descended from ancestors of the people who originally came to Massachusetts in order to get people to become more religious and more involved in their church. Now, Salem is a famous town because of their witch trials. They basically persecuted people just based on their own social beliefs. There was no tangible evidence that anyone was a witch, but the role of xenophobia and hatred, as well as the role of the judges and how they judged whether people were witches or not, those were examined very carefully after this whole event, and it laid the groundwork for how the founding fathers would look at their judicial system. This next section of our review focuses on European nations and empires and how they interacted with Native Americans and how they went about their colonization of the continent. So the first empire we're going to look at is the Dutch Empire, based in the Netherlands. Their colonies included colonies in New York, New Jersey, and Delaware, and they were remarkably peaceful and nice people to the Native Americans. they had a greater amount of gender equality and racial equality when slavery came to the Americas than the English and the French. So overall, they were a more accepting society compared to the other empires. The Dutch were a very trade based empire. They were the rulers of trade in Europe and in the North Atlantic. So they weren't pursuing colonization per se, but they wanted to have forts and places in the Americas where they could sell their goods. The Navigation Acts were passed by the British Parliament in response to them seeing that the Dutch were outdoing them in trade. So it stopped the English colonies from trading with the Dutch, and it said that they could only trade with their mother country, with England. So eventually, of course, the colonies stopped trading with the Dutch, and this made it harder for the Dutch to retain their place as the world leaders of trade. Eventually, the British became the leaders of the world, and they were in charge of trade everywhere from America to India to the for all over the world. So this is a map of the French Empire and the British Empire in America. You can see Louisiana, this big area here, as well as Quebec, right up in the northeast. These were huge areas of French settlement in the North American continent. Next, we'll talk about the Spanish Empire. They were based mainly in Latin and South America, and they were really the leaders of American colonization before the French and the English had their colonies on the American continent. So they were famous for not treating the Native Americans very well. In fact, they treated them basically like how the English treated their slaves when slavery started becoming popular. And the rumors of the Spanish people not treating Native Americans well came to be known as the Black Legend, these horror stories of what the Spanish did to Native Americans. Now, on the high seas in the North Atlantic, pirates ruled the seas as well as the empires. So military strength as well as trade strength was important in maintaining relationships with other empires and with colonies for the British and the French and the Dutch and the Spanish. So not only would nations compete with each other in trade, but also militarily out on the ocean. So that made a strong navy the essential part of having a strong empire. Like I mentioned before, the French didn't have many big settlements, but they were based on trade a little bit like the Dutch. They traded fur, and they were relatively nice to natives compared to the Spanish and the English, and they had a couple wars against Spain and England before the American Revolution, and as these were the three main military powers of that time. Finally, we'll get to the English Empire. So, of course, the English colonies were very diversified in how they saw politics and religion and their social views. In the North, especially in New England, the colonies were based on religion, but in the South, for example, Virginia, the colonists moved there not because of their religion, but because of their economic status in their home countries. So the English fought several wars, like I mentioned, with the French. They fought Queen Anne's War, the War of Spanish Succession, and they gained a bunch of territory, mostly on the eastern coast of North America, and they often fought against the Native Americans of that area. In this last section, we'll be talking about what were the institutions and what were the ideas that led to the American Revolution and to America as it was just after the Revolution. We already talked about indentured servitude being the main form of labor in the colonies. We talked about the headright system and how that made indentured servitude more wanted, particularly in Virginia and in Maryland. um, the way that indentured servitude worked was that poor people would sign contracts in their home countries saying that in exchange for travel to the New World, they would work for someone for, say, 10 years. And after that, they were supposed to be paid what were called their freedom dues. But however, their work was so horrible and their conditions were so terrible that very few servants ever lived to be set free. Now, Bacon's rebellion in 1676 were a bunch of armed colonists who supported this planter class man named Nathaniel Bacon, who took over the Virginia colony. And this rebellion was eventually ended when English warships arrived in Virginia. But this showed the danger of having a class of recently freed indentured servants. So this spurred the Virginia government to look for a different source of labor, and this eventually led to them implementing slavery. The Middle Passage was the main way that slaves came from Africa to America. They called it the Middle Passage because it was part of the triangular trade route that connected Europe, America, and Africa. For example, sugar and rum traveled along this trade route, and packaged goods as well came to the Americas by this triangular trade route. 1 in 5 slaves died before reaching the New World because, first of all, the conditions on the ship were very bad and very unsanitary. Diseases like smallpox and measles, that should say, spread very quickly on the ship. Now, the political ideas of that time and the political ideas that most influenced John Locke were those of having a social contract, a contract between the governed and the government, between equals. So John Locke was an English thinker. He published 2 treatises of government, and these 2 treatises vastly impact how the founding fathers wanted to set the American government as a mutual consent by the American people to have this democratic government. Benjamin Franklin, he embodied the ideals of the Enlightenment, which was this huge movement at the time in Europe of people looking at things rationally, people examining political and social constructs in their society and determining whether they were reasonable or not. Benjamin Franklin embodied these ideas because not only was he a self educated man, he was skilled at a wide variety of things, from writing in Poor Richard's Almanac to his scientific experiments proving that lightning was electricity. So he was the main man in America for the Enlightenment. This is a quote from John Locke, of course, from his second treatise of government, saying that by men he means all humans, should be able to consent to being governed. If they do not consent, then they do not have any need to be governed. Now, the Great Awakening was a religious movement that started in the 1720s and 1730s and spread across the colonies. Preachers such as George Whitefield adopted a new, very vivid way of preaching. They talked about the horrors and of eternal damnation and contrasted that with how heaven was and what would happen to good souls, good Christian souls. So this not only was a movement in the colonies, but was a worldwide movement of the resurgence of fundamentalism. For example, Islam in the Arabic world was becoming rationalized, or should I say, fundamentalized by the resurgence of Wahhabism, which sought to revert Islam back to its basics. Now, the main difference between preachers of the Great Awakening and between preachers before them were that they thought that religion was a personal belief and that organized religion wasn't as true of a religion as personal religion. This is part of Jonathan Edwards' sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. The two main figureheads of the Great Awakening you should know are Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. They were both known for their very charismatic way of preaching to their followers. Now, finally, where does this leave the colonies? Well, the colonies are filled with people who know about these political ideas from John Locke and from the Enlightenment in Europe, and they also have this new religion in them, that they have this renewed sense of how they are moral and what morals should be. So this will leave the colonists wondering whether their political institutions are correct morally and that their religion should be for themselves. Thanks for joining me for this review session. If you want to review different periods of American history, we have videos from all of our review sessions in 2016, and good luck on the AP test.